I'm happy to be joined today by award-winning best-selling author Michael Shellenberger. He is an environmental activist, and his latest book is something that is already generating a ton of attention and controversy. It's called Apocalypticenvironmentalism: Why Environmental Alarmism Hurts Us All. Michael, thanks so much for taking the time to join me today.
Thanks for having me on, Ben.
So before we get started with your book, which I'm currently reading and really enjoying, I want to get a little bit of your background. I think people who are familiar with the conversation about both environmental policy, climate policy, and other areas related to the ethics of how we approach how we live on this planet are doubtlessly familiar with your work. But you have a pretty long career and one in which you've done a lot of different things and worked in a lot of different areas. Maybe give us a bit of a thumbnail on your background and everything leading up to this book.
Sure. So I am a longtime environmental activist. I consider myself an environmental activist. It's the main thing I do. I'm also a journalist and an energy analyst. I started as a very left-wing kid. I went to Nicaragua to help the Sandinista socialist revolution in the late 80s. Learned Portuguese so I could work in the Amazon, in part to work with the Workers' Party of Brazil. I interviewed Lula, the former Workers' Party president of Brazil, and a number of others, and have always sort of combined journalism and activism. I have changed my mind about a bunch of important questions over the last 15 years. So 15 years ago, I co-authored an essay called The Death of Environmentalism. It was a very famous essay. It was on the front page of the New York Times. And really the last 15 years, I've basically continued to peel the onion or chase the rabbit down the hole, one of those two metaphors. And I feel like this is the bookend to Death of Environmentalism. This is sort of the culmination of that work, which has basically just been willing to take a hard look at everything, try to get clear about what the facts were on the science was for a number of issues. And, but I'm also a full-time, I spend a lot of my time because I care a lot about nuclear power. I think nuclear power is one of the most important technologies in the world. So I spend a lot of time advocating for nuclear as well, both for climate reasons, but also for other economic and environmental reasons.
I remember, first off, of course, I remember the essay at the New York Times, but really I've paid a lot of attention to your work in recent years on nuclear because I feel like it's such an area that is underdeveloped in the conversation that takes place in the public square, certainly in the media landscape. And you've been one of the few voices out there hammering away with a lot of truth that I think that people haven't necessarily paid as much attention to as they ought to. When did you start to feel like your frustrations with the way that the media was framing these stories was reaching a point where you needed to create something like this book, which certainly does chart a path of criticizing a lot of assumptions that leaders have or that activists might have or propagate. But it's also kind of a book about media criticism. You begin with this element of media criticism in the book. Why do you think that the media frame of this is the way that it is and leaves so many aspects out?
Yeah, I mean, there's basically three groups that are responsible for the alarmism, this apocalyptic discourse. It's the Malthusian scientists who, I get into more detail, but Malthusian scientists, obviously the climate activists and the environmental activists, and then the journalists. And so obviously the subtitle is Why Environmental Alarmism Hurts Us All. It's a criticism of the journalists for engaging in alarmism. I'm working on a piece right now to talk about how they use weather events as a way to deliberate strategy to increase public salience with climate change, even though the deaths from natural disasters have been going down dramatically and there's been no increase in costs from natural disasters. So the journalists are actively participating in the alarmism. I mean, it's a journalist that wrote this book called Sixth Extinction, which suggests that humans are creating a mass extinction. It's completely false. There's zero evidence for it. There's never been evidence for it. We're not on track for that. There's a lot of reasons to think that actually we're going to have more habitat. The number of protected areas are going up. The amount of land we use for meat and food production is going down. So, I mean, there's just basically the thumbnail version is everything they've said, everything important they've said about the environment is wrong. And I felt the need to just get it all in one place, in part because I knew it would be dangerous for me to do it. And I just thought, you just got to do it all at once, and then I can defend it afterwards. And if I end up losing some friends or funders or whatever, at least I lose them all at once, and then I can rebuild something based on what I think is the proper scientific view.
I have a technical question for you before we start unpacking some of that. Whenever you come out with a book that challenges the dominant narrative, whatever the area, but particularly I think the narrative as it relates to aspects that have, a focus primarily on science, you are going to be someone who is picked apart, where basically any mistake that you make in the book is amplified to the degree that, a book about history or a book that has less to do with scientific and political, lightning rods doesn't have that level of attention.
Right.
When you went about writing this book, what methods did you use to make sure that you would have basically the strongest case that you possibly could, that there would be very few aspects of your argument that people could pick apart as not being, the strongest example of the case?
Right. Well, so obviously, Twitter is the ultimate hot take, right? So this book is a really cold take. I mean, what's great about a book is that a book requires you to publish slowly. I mean, you've got these drafts that go in, and then people and respect, they read the drafts. And in many cases, I just had the main experts read the drafts. So it was kind of like, all right, well, that was like the main scientist in that area. Or I had long interviews with them in some cases, particularly Amazon. It was like the main character in that chapter is the leading expert on the Amazon deforestation. So that was, I think that's first and foremost. I mean, the other thing I did very deliberately is that I published much of the science as it relates to climate change, fires, deforestation last year, got these guys on the record in those publications, made sure they saw it, the scientists and others, so that if they could raise a fact check problem or some question or whatever, they would do that. Actually, nothing ever got raised. So I felt much more secure about then putting it in the book later. But then, yeah, I mean, you're going through this draft because you want to write it strong. You want to write it as strong as possible. Then you go through it, and then by edit after edit, by finding the time you get to the end, it's really just the best science. I mean, there's some marginal stuff you'd go, it doesn't seem like that relevant or whatever. So, I mean, in some ways, I feel like the evidentiary core of this book is not that complicated. Like, it's a pretty straightforward story about rising power densities, rising energy consumption, concentrating food and energy production. And the evidence, it all aligns as well just with the theory, that if you would think if you have higher power densities of energy and food, you would use less natural environment. That would be the prediction shows up, and we give all these examples of it. So, and then by the way, I should just shout out I do have a small research institute, and my staff just did incredible work, particularly the ways in which scientists have been so misleading on this whole sixth mass extinction claim. It took some work to figure out exactly what they were doing. You're meeting with your staff, and you're kind of like, what are they doing here to come up with this result? So anyway, I'll stop there. I assume
I feel like something changed in the conversation around climate in the past 2 decades, where the conversation went from being one that was mostly about figuring out what was happening, why it was happening, to what degree humanity could change their behavior or advance policy to alter what was happening, to one that was basically had a lot more of a severe and panicked tone to the way that people addressed what to me was mostly a very serious debate and subject, one that would involve not just scientists and governments, but balancing policy priorities and the like.
Right.
And to me, that panic is something that you explain in your book in terms of the process that was happening. Maybe give our listeners a little bit. What do you believe was happening there that took this conversation from being a scientific debate, or primarily a scientific and policy debate, to being one where basically it was just gradations of how much you're freaked out by something, as opposed to a more sedate or serious process?
Yeah, so I mean the first core concept in this book is this concept of apocalypse, and the concept of apocalypse is often conflated with the concept of Armageddon, which is just the end. But apocalypse was always supposed to have the end of some civilization or the world or something, and then a new beginning. That was so there's always a Armageddon plus utopia, and that's always been in the environmental movement from the 60s on. Earth Day, so you see these moments that tend towards one pole more than the other. Earth Day tended more towards the utopianism, but you get to Al Gore's Armageddon, and I think that trend has continued. I mean, there was also a period there, which was a lot of the Michael Pollan, we're all going to eat free-range cows and be harmonized with nature through our gardening and our eating fancy food. So there's always been that there, but yeah, for sure. I mean, I noted in the book that I think a part of this is just clearly that because the global system is in a reversion towards nationalism, which is obviously something that you guys are thinking a lot about, and is the whole Trump and Brexit and just so many other governments around the world reverting to nationalism. And so I think that the left, which is really part of the global elite, the globalizing elite, the media community, the universities, the educated class, has been just horrified and shocked by Brexit and Trump. And I think that created an apocalyptic mood, and then that led. It's interesting. I kind of was like, those people that are out there on Black Lives Matter protesting are the same people that were out there last year on climate. Like, yes. I think it was kind of, whatever, right? I'm exaggerating, but it was probably some pretty heavy overlap between those two groups. So the left became more apocalyptic. That's not to say they weren't apocalyptic before. You certainly were. There's been apocalypse, and before. I note that the apocalypse was often around too many babies, overpopulation, particularly in poor countries. They need sterilization camps and the rest. And then also around nuclear and nuclear weapons and nuclear energy. And then you get to climate change. Mm-hmm. Not coincidentally, because the threat of nuclear war goes way down after the end of the Cold War. And so I think that I argue the left needed a new apocalypse and was able to create that out of climate.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, one of the comparisons that I would make and that have made on the right is that, and this is not to say that the threat isn't real, but that essentially the right used the threat of Islamic terrorism to have the same effect on their political coalition domestically that the Soviet Union had in the past, that it papered over basically a lot of different gaps in priorities between fiscal and social conservatives because, there's this, universally existential threat, which, can be debated, but it's one of these things where a lot of those things work as substitutes. That element of apocalypse is not something, though, that I remember as a kid in the 90s going to the Earth Day stuff in Washington, D.C. Mm-hmm. I remember that being more about clean water and air and conserving wildlife and mm-hmm. Are we planting enough trees? It just had a much more calm attitude in my recollection. And a lot of it was like environmentalists versus union workers and that type of thing, like which priority is going to take hold. Right. What you recount in this book in terms of the embrace of this apocalypse narrative by the Extinction of Rebellion people and everything else, it doesn't seem to really come from a scientific place, even though that's the reputation they advance. Why don't they get more of the questions that you put forward in this book about their attitude toward everything that's happening?
Right. Well, the short answer is because the journalists are as apocalyptic as the activists. So the journalists don't want to ask those questions. I'm about to post a transcript where I actually, because they were coming, the Australians are very aggressive. So that
yes,
the Australian Guardian and the Sydney,
I was going to ask you about that, but go ahead. Yes.
Well, yeah. So basically, long story, but basically they come after me with these nasty questions, basically making false accusations, and I'm like, I'm not going to answer, when did you stop being your wife? It's just like if you answer, that's like you're doomed, right? You can't answer that question. So I wrote an open because I documented this behavior, and I went out and I said, I'll do interviews with you guys, but they need to be recorded and on Zoom. I mean, talk about technological revolution. You certainly could record conversations in the past, but it was harder to do these video conversations, right? So sure enough, I got an interview with the Sydney Morning Herald national climate and environment editor, Nick O'Malley, and I'm grateful to him that he actually did this with me. And there's like a 50 or 45 minute talk of us I just put online. And in that talk, he shows that he doesn't know the difference or think the difference matters between natural disasters, which is deaths and property damage, and the weather event itself, like the hurricane and how big it is. Well, and then there's a sense in which I keep getting this from people. They go, "Oh, Michael, you're just making a mountain out of a molehill. You're splitting hairs, whatever." It's like, this is like the main thing you're talking about is that disasters are supposedly getting worse from climate change. But how could that be if fewer people are dying from climate change and there's been no change in costs? So they're trying to have this, they slip into this. I'm about to write about this. They slip from, they go, Michael's wrong about what he says about climate change and natural disasters. We can see climate change having made many extreme events more intense or common. Well, it's like, well, you see what you just did there? You just changed from disaster to weather event or extreme event. And now that I have them, including the journalist, I'm going to blow the whistle on it, and Twitter allows me to. So yeah, I mean, these journalists, I mean, like, you know, they're just activists. And I have to say, I think what's great about the fragmentation of the media right now is that now it's kind of like, okay, we know that the New York Times reporters are activists. They just happen to work at a newspaper. They're no less activists than you at the Federalist or me. So we can put that aside, that there's some sort of difference between what people are doing, that we and that really then the question is kind of, are you open with what your beliefs are? You know, at least with me, I mean, well, you're pro-nuclear, so yeah, and at least you know that. Like, I'm not pretending like you guys, they are, to be agnostic when they're not. So, you know, I think that's the positive part of it. But yeah, I mean, I think that the social media environment has been game changing in this, you know, for this book. You know, my publisher said that they never saw books sell this well where the author wasn't on television. You know, I still haven't been on television. I was like hoping to get on television, but you know, it's a pretty busy news environment. So but the social media is game changing. I got censored by Facebook like 2 days ago. So I wrote, and I was really upsetting. I wrote this long thing and I put it on Twitter, but it got like more attention than anything. I was like, oh, okay, fine, censor me. You know, it's like, I don't like it, but I think it is a really different media environment than just a couple of years ago.
Well, I'm sure you're probably familiar with the Streisand Effect, you know, where you call, whereby trying to shut something down, you call attention to it. I certainly think that you're experiencing that with this book.
Yeah.
You mentioned earlier, and I'd like you to get into this whole sixth extinction idea. Tell our listeners where that idea came from and what the actual facts are.
Okay. So this is, you always hear this. This is a famous Pulitzer Prize winning book. The Pulitzer Committee gave this book their highest prize, even though we're not in a sixth mass extinction. Humans are not creating a sixth mass extinction. We're just not making enough species extinct, and we've always known that, and there's never been any evidence for it. Where does it come from? It came from something called a species area model, which made some assumptions about how many species they thought, or I'm sorry, how many individuals of a species could survive on a given piece of land. Super crude. They were often used for islands, but then they would apply them elsewhere. They're super crude models, and basically they just overestimated how much land or habitat different species would require. So they would assume extinctions, and it just turns out that species are a lot better, you know, crowding into smaller amounts of land than anybody imagined. And, you know, people kind of go, but okay, Michael, but aren't you, you know, being, again, splitting hairs is sort of the idea. And it's like, well, no, because actually, if you think that, like, first of all, extinction is just a deathly word. It's designed to alarm people. And if you think that we're already causing extinct are going extinct, and so I think that removes the resolve to save those species. The reality is that we've lost a lot of wild animals as humans have spread over the earth for the last 50 years, but we've also protected a lot of areas, and there's things that we can do to save them, and we should not lose hope. In fact, this would be the time to have a lot of hope that we can actually set aside more of the earth for other animal species.
I know that there had to be a priority in your head about the different aspects of these debates that you would have to deal with within this book. As you were outlining it, what did you think were the most important aspects that you wanted people to have as takeaways? What did you want to teach the reader about what was going on in the media space and in this debate that they would really walk away from and say, hey, you really need to their friend who might disagree with them or might not be familiar with your work, you really need to read Shellenberger's book because it's going to change your mind about X?
Yeah, so I'd say the first, because the book's in thirds, a debunking first third. The second third is how humans actually save nature in the real world. And then the third section is why, if environmental problems are manageable, do we think that they're the end of the world? And so the first third, I would say I want people to know that, the biggest, that climate change is real. It's not the end of the world. It's not even our biggest environmental problem. Our biggest environmental problem is the continued use of wood fuel by 1 to 2 billion people around the world and the continued eating of wild animals. Those are like these not only the biggest problems if you care about nature, what we call nature, they're also completely underappreciated. That goes for overeating wild fish, which is, I think, seen as kind of a trivial issue or something, but it's massive in terms of its impacts on sea life. So that in that climate change, it's real and we should do something about it. We should seek to reduce our emissions because honestly, the hotter it gets, the more energies in the system and the more problems there could be. And also the more that habitats shift and species move, but it's just not what people thought. And it also means, and we're also going in the right direction. I mean, this is the other thing nobody knows. Carbon emissions have peaked in most rich countries and are going down. They peaked in Germany, France, and Britain in the mid 70s. They're going to peak globally next 10 years or so, I think. Maybe it could be 20, could be now, but they're going to peak and go down. And that means that we're going to be closer to 3 degrees than 4. For conservatives, I wanted to say, I wanted to have this information, but conservatives, I just wanted to say, spent a lot of time explaining the basic science of warming. I don't think it's helpful or going anywhere. And the real issue is just it's not the end of the world, and it's not the most important environmental problem. So just let's focus on the science. The second part of the book, I would say, we should know that it's a story of energy. And so if you go from what we want to do is use more energy and less nature. And that sounds weird, but a lump of uranium, think of it this way, a lump of uranium has enough energy for my entire life. A lump of wood has enough energy, if I'm a small farmer in Africa, to cook a pot of beans. Like that's it, right? So that's energy density. So the more of that uranium you use, then you can leave the wood in the forests. And you can use all that energy to have food in greenhouses and domesticated meat. And so basically it's a picture of concentrating human activities in cities, agriculture, power production, moving towards higher energy dense fuels. That's, for me, it's like if that could be the orientation of it, then the World Bank policies, the Republican Party's policies, the Democratic Party policies, it would be completely reoriented from the garbage that is currently viewed as important on energy and climate change and simply isn't.
One of the aspects of this that comes up quite a bit is the fact that, basically, and this is, it's a vast generalization, but the West as being a place that has experienced the benefits of energy modernization, while major populations in other parts of the world do not have those benefits. Who are we to say, you can't catch up, you can't get the air conditioning that you want, et cetera, because of what we view as being a higher environmental priority? What are the ways that we can puncture through that type of cultural divide, that civilizational divide, where we basically say, it's a shame that you've got so many millions upon millions, even 1 billion people who are behind us. For the sake of the environment, you can't catch up. What is the proper solution, or what policymakers ought to advocate given that situation?
Yeah, the first thing is when you go, what kind of people are you? What kind of people are we if we would seek to deny cheap energy and prosperity to the world's poorest people? I think we'd be pretty terrible people. At a minimum, it's not very Christian, but even as if you're an Enlightenment atheist, it's not consistent with Kantian values. It's not consistent with do unto others or the categorical imperative. It's absolutely unethical and outrageous. And yet it's been the moral center of this apocalyptic environmentalism. They even have something they call lifeboat ethics, which is just as nasty as that sounds. That is the idea, by the way, is that you're inside the lifeboat and you're trying to keep other people out. It's not the dude trying to get in the lifeboat. This is horrible. We're not in a lifeboat. We have functionally infinite energy, and there's no resource scarcity to speak of. In fact, that kind of discourse has always been used to deprive people of prosperity. So I think it's quite sinister. I think Malthusianism is quite sinister. I think I agree with Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels, who said that Thomas Malthus was a stain on the human race. I think this is just an abomination. If I could give advice to Republicans, I think you ought to take up this mantle, because the radical left is just taking an absolutely immoral position. I mean, here I document how Patrick Leahy, the Democratic senator from Vermont, has sought to cut off funding for hydroelectric. Even that's where Vermont gets its electricity. I document my fellow environmentalists here in Berkeley trying to stop the Congo from getting a hydroelectric dam, even though our electricity significantly comes from hydroelectric dams. So this is just unacceptable. It needs to be it just needs to be made unacceptable in the society. Given that, I know who, you guys, where you're at, I just kind of go, for Republicans, it's always been, that's the Democratic sandbox and we don't want to mess with the environment. I just think that's bullshit and has to change. The Republicans have got to start challenging the radical left. It's frankly what more moderate Democrats need. Like those of us that consider ourselves, I used to think of myself as a progressive. I guess I'm now a moderate Democrat. Well, now, the moderate Democrats, we would love to have Republicans beating the shit out of the radical left on this stuff. It's just sick. It's terrible.
Just in terms of your sandbox comment, it worked out so well for Republicans to let Democrats have the education sandbox and the healthcare sandbox to themselves for decades. So
it doesn't make any sense. And also, you start to see left and right are breaking down. I mean, I'm sorry, how is that a progressive thing to prevent poor countries from? I don't think most workaday liberal people are on board with depriving poor countries of cheap energy. I know they're not.
Is there an aspect of this, just as long as we're speaking about the politics of it, where Republicans could seek to kind of fracture the environmental left's favoring of a lot of these wrong-headed policies that do not actually benefit people, and all of these different aspects in a way that maybe the political advisors on Capitol Hill might not see for themselves as an obvious way to approach it. When people are closer to the policy issue, they tend to see, there's a way for you to thread the needle on this and do something that's good for people, but also exposes the fractures in their own coalition. What do you think about that?
Yeah, of course. I mean, everybody's, anyway, I'm in California, not in Washington, for a reason, because I find that kind of thinking very narrow. But yeah, I'm sure, look, if you do a poll, renewables are more popular than nuclear. So the kind of the dumb consultant view of this, I actually totally disagree, is to convince people that nuclear is necessary for renewables or something and just kind of cross-dress it. It's like, well, why don't we just tell people the truth about this stuff and actually be evidence-based? There's a real moral issue here. I mean, we fund the World Bank. The World Bank has diverted basically all of its money from doing cheap, reliable power plants, whether hydroelectric dams, nuclear plants, or fossil fuel plants, to unreliable and expensive renewables like solar panels and batteries, which are like charitable endeavors. It's not how you develop a country. It's not how you power the factories. It's not how you provide the city with lights at night so women are safe and kids are safe to walk around. I mean, I find it now. I think the problem what happened with the right, I talk about this very briefly, is that they would sort of talk about this stuff in terms of like market deeper than that underneath it all, which is a physical process. I have a disagreement with Bjorn Lomborg, who I respect in a lot of ways for pushing back on the alarmism, but he's always kind of like, look, I've done this model and I've hired these really smart economists, and we found out that the money should go into immunizations and not on climate change. Was lost there, you're basically saying, trust us, we're experts. So it's just dueling experts. What I wanted to do here was to say, no, there's actually a reason why. There's power density explains why nuclear is better than fossil fuels and why fossil fuels are better than renewables. Renewables just require hundreds of times more land and resource than fossil fuels. and that's bad for the environment. And you don't need to pander to people's ignorance. The fact that people don't know anything about renewables should not make Republicans basically repeat back ignorant statements. I think it's terrible for everybody.
Yeah. Well, I think that, again, that goes back to the sandbox issue you raised. But there's also the kind of academic side of this debate. And that's one where I think you have to say that in the last decade and a half, we've seen a number of mainstream scientists who question aspects of the favored policy approach of various people being really pushed out or even blacklisted in some cases by their fellow academics. This is something that we see kind of spreading within the culture war space in a number of different areas. I don't know if you saw this, these latest requests from Princeton, for instance, of having an anti-racist board approve any kind of research that academics wanted to do.
Right.
Do you think that this is a space where something can be done to make sure that you get back to a more traditional academic dialogue on this subject, or is that battle already lost?
Well, I mean, this is a really interesting question. I deal with this a little bit in the final chapter, which is sort of ways in which the story I tell, which is, by the way, is not my story. I mean, I'm in every instance, whether it's on climate science or forests or psychology or theology, I'm always drawing on other scholars. So there's a large body of research that suggests that as people stop believing in traditional God, they stop believing in traditional religion, they still have a need for some religious kind of beliefs. Most people still need to feel like their life, we do need to feel like our lives matter, that we're not just worm food. And that, and often for people, that's their grandkids, a sense of immortality, or you write a book, or, you kind of, but I think other people get caught up in kind of a heroic story. They get kind of like, I'm out to save the world. It gets very Marvel comic oriented. And then, so I see what's happening now, obviously not just on the environment, but also on race and racism and sex and identity. It's all flowing from multiple factors, obviously, but I think one of them is there's no external enemy. So we don't have, Republicans, you guys should have gone after China. That was the real enemy, not when the Islamic terrorism, it's not, you got to do security and stuff. I'm not suggesting it's not a problem. It's not China, for Christ's sake. You're talking about a country that's just like 3 times larger than we are and just hegemonic everywhere in the world. Come on. It's crazy, right? So we should be afraid of China, but we're killing each other now. We're going after each other in this kind of religious war. So for sure. And, that thing I describe in my book, speaking of cancel culture, the most important scientist on climate change and disasters whose work finds climate change is not increasing disasters, because disasters are not increasing or becoming worse. And I document how they really went after him. They even had a member of Congress try to do an investigation. Here he's like completely clean, never taken a dime from anybody. He's a Democrat. He's a environmentalist. And because his thing threatened the public relations strategy of Center for American Progress and the Democratic Party and the big environmental groups, they just absolutely, and the Times, frankly, the New York Times participated in the wilding against him. And they totally went after him. So yeah, I think it's disturbing. Now, I don't think that we're going to be able to revert back to a period that we imagined existed, where the university was somehow morality free or values free. I don't think that ever really existed. I think these universities came out of often the Christian church or Christianity, Oxford and Harvard and whatever. And so, in the book, I talk about how the culture of despair sets in because of secularization in the 50s. And that's where you get this whole sense of which this is all just a gigantic mistake. Civilization is a mistake. It just leads to death camps and the bomb. That's the story that we're told, and our lives are meaningless. There's no God, and this is just anything goes. That's terrible and it's wrong. So I think the way that what's going to have to happen with these institutions is that they're going to need to have new leadership, and the leadership is offering a new vision, and the new vision is going to have to be an ethical vision. It can't be an amoral vision. I don't even know if I think that's possible. I don't think it is possible. I think the universities actually do have to teach ethics. I'm shocked by how many young people graduate from college who I talk to as a progressive, as a liberal, and you talk to them and they go, and I go, well, I was like, well, we need free speech. And they're like, well, yeah, unless it's, unless it's hurtful language. And I'm like, no, actually, that doesn't. What?
That doesn't work.
You're like, has it been hundreds of years for free speech? And you're like, well, but it can't be hurtful. And what? Like, we're going to censor that if it's hurtful? Or, I mean, I think the thing we're seeing now is it's basically I'm getting attacked and attempted censored. Certainly Roger Pilkey for saying true things, right? And that's what all of these people are getting canceled for, is actually saying something true. I always point out, I don't remember George Orwell describing the journalists themselves as the advocates for censorship. I mean, it was the government, but here it is, they're coming from the journalists to demand that certain things not be allowed to be said or published. It's yikes.
For ages, I would always say, oh, well, Huxley was right, Orwell was wrong, about the future of the West. Now it turns out they're both right. It's really confusing to me.
They're both right, yeah. Because was Huxley arguing that it was the journalists that were
Huxley was more about us, the soma, us kind of, putting ourselves into this permanent coma where we never really want to achieve anything, and it's just, a kind of crushing ourselves as opposed to government crushing us. The aspect, I mean, you mentioned that you wrote about it in the closing chapter, but it's quite eloquent the way that you describe it. Apocalyptic environmentalism, you write, gives people a purpose to save the world from climate change or some other environmental disaster. It provides people with a story that casts them as heroes, and with some scholars, as we will see, believe we need in order to find meaning in our lives. At the same time, apocalyptic environmentalism does all this while retaining the illusion among its adherents that they are a people of science and reason, not superstition and fantasy. To me, this is the big challenge of your book, because it's very difficult in any argument to tell someone that they are wrong in a way that can convince them to question themselves. As I'm sure you've experienced in the social media age, when you put something out there that conflicts with people's assumptions or the belief that they have, rather than use that to really question things or to relate how, this made me reconsider things, many people will just double down. They'll say, no, you're wrong. Every fact check you put forward about Greta Thunberg is just you judging a child who's trying to save the planet. Who are you to do something like that?
Right.
How do you advance this argument in a way that can actually be effective in convincing people, no, this apocalyptic attitude that you have, that's not actually what's happening. And in fact, you should be hopeful because of that, because there's all types of things that we can do to help mitigate this problem. And the problem is not the apocalyptic Armageddon event that you seem to think it is.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know exactly what will work, but obviously I felt like writing the book was the first big step. I also felt like making sure people knew that I had particular environmental commitments, that I have this particular history, and that I seriously do care about mountain gorillas and penguins and climate change, and these things are all really important to me. So I think that was been part of it. I mean, I think the other was, we knew that there would be attacks on the book, and of course that's kind of in some extent needed them or hoped for them, because that's what you want, is you want to have a conversation. So we created a lot of the charts. My colleague did, Madison, created all the citations on there. And we're starting to use Twitter and video more creatively. I mean, that's why I love this conversation with you. And so I'm not yet there yet. I'm able to do it, but I will. Like when the New York Times puts out its daily climate catastrophe article, which is what almost about as frequently as it is, I'm just going to respond to it on Twitter and below it and whatever. And these reporters who they don't block me, they shouldn't block me. I'll tweet this out and show how they're wrong, and it's embarrassing. I mean, part of me goes, it's just that simple. It's just embarrassing. And I'll do it with the scientists too. And we're just going to do that. It doesn't take a lot of time. It's actually really efficient. You can just be like, yeah, you got this wrong and you're misleading people, and here's how. I do think that's going to work. And part of the reason I do think it's going to work is that I've basically been doing it on nuclear for like 5 years really, since I got on Twitter, which was just like, it does work. I mean, it's amazing. I can't, unfortunately, I can't exactly measure it, but I just know from 5 years ago, people just don't say the ridiculous things they used to say about nuclear. They don't accuse me of the ridiculous things they used to accuse me of. The data's all up there. I've just made it much more available. So I think that does matter. But there's a deeper question, which is that if people have this need to be religious about something, and if politics is that venue for which people become religious and they pursue their heroic struggles and their religiosity, I think you do have to just have to surface that may be what's going on. And I don't think with exactly judgment, because, I think there's been some sense, like, in response to my thing last week, people were like, they're like, hey man, how high does this thing go, dude? Does it go to like the head of the United Nations? Like, is he in on it? And, and you're like, well, yeah, they're in on it, but they really believe this. Like, this is like their, like, it's like you'd be like, asking Christians, come on, you really think there's a God? I mean, come on. It's like, they're not faking it. They really believe it.
Does this go all the way up to that guy with the hat in Rome?
Yeah, exactly. Is he in on it? The Pope? The source of all great conspiracy theories. So I mean, I do think some of it just bringing some awareness. I think the other thing I would say is that I don't think that you can be. I think there's a way in which we all actually do need faith just to exist. You need to believe in something. You need to have some belief in something that gives your life some special meaning. There's nothing wrong with that. In fact, it's kind of beautiful. It's what makes humans special and different from my dog. My dog worries about eating and going on a walk, but it doesn't contemplate his death. Only humans do that, but that's terrifying. And so we have to construct these stories. That's totally fine and natural, but it's when you lose sight of that. It's when you think that, no, I'm not a religiously environmentalist. I'm just true to the science. And all y'all others are demonic and evil and working for the man or whatever. That's where things start to get really crazy as they've gotten.
So, Michael, let's go out on this. There's a strong element of something that happens when you are a person who stands up and questions the narrative, which is that if you actually make a really good argument, people on the other side typically don't want to sit down and have a conversation with you. They don't really want to debate you. They don't seek out the strongest arguer. They're going to seek out someone who has been, paid by an industry, or who has some kind of compromising nature to them, or doesn't know the science, or doesn't come from a strong background in terms of advancing their argument. Do you think that you'll be able to have the opportunity, or has anyone reached out to you yet, where you will be able to sit down and debate, because, given the shutdowns and everything like that, and the fact that everybody's been Zooming and Skyping and Microsoft Meeting and everything else, there's no real excuse not to have a conversation like that.
I know. Yes, I mean, I hope so, but so far they haven't. I mean, like Greta Thunberg, right, would be the obvious person, or AOC or whatever. My hope is that there is. I mean, I do think, I note in the book, we did have we had a real panic in the United States about overpopulation, like in the late 60s, early 70s, like women were in college saying, I'm never going to have kids because there's too many people. And it was always the same kind of, like, you'd be like, well, how exactly is the end of the world going to come from too many people? And they could never say. It'd be like climate change. So all of this is going to, so we've had these moral panics before. They do end. So, I mean, that's, I think, a little reassuring, is that the moral panics end. Nobody really brags about being a Marxist anymore, and when I call people Malthusian, they get really mad, as they should, because it's terrible to be a Malthusian. The solution is not for me to stop calling them that. It's the solution for them to stop being that. I will say it's interesting. I mean, if you're psychologically aware at all, and it's hard to be, and especially when people are attacking you, but what I notice is that they always, like when I'm talking to somebody about the evidence, whether it's this journalist or somebody else, you'll get to the point where they know they don't have a response, they don't have anything on their side, and that is the moment that they attack you personally. On the stuff on those disasters, what they're doing is they're saying, "Oh, Michael, Michael, I mean, they kind of go, Michael, what are you doing? Like, what are you doing?" I'm like, well, I'm trying to kind of call you out for misusing the word disasters. Well, what are you trying to say? You're trying to say there's no risk of climate change? I'm like, no, seems like a pretty important distinction, actually. And so, but then that they know at some level that they're wrong on that. And so they're actually telling you, where you need to be.
Yes.
And
Yeah.
horrible and awkward as it is, it's like, okay, I guess actually we're going to spend some time talking about climate change and natural disasters because you're so goddamn sensitive about it. It's like all big family therapy meeting. Let's come back to your relationship with your mother. It's like you keep talking about it. It seems like there's something in there. I mean, I think that's religion. I don't think like people always say, well, that doesn't work. You just tell someone that. It doesn't. Well, no, but you kind of to chill people out a little bit. That this is maybe this kind of hyperbolic alarmism is not really useful or helpful to anybody.
Mm-hmm. Well, Michael, I wish you the best of luck with this book. I
Thanks.
hope that you do have the opportunity to have a conversation at some point with Representative Ocasio-Cortez. I would look forward to seeing a conversation between you two. You can find Apocalypse Never online and wherever books are sold. Congratulations on your success with it, Michael, and good luck. And people should follow you on Twitter. I believe you're at Shellenberger.
At Shellenberger MD, and I'm not saying I'm an MD. That's my initials. It is Shellenberger MD. Yep.
Great. Thank you, Michael. I'm Ben Domenech. You've been listening to another edition of the Federalist Radio Hour. We'll be back soon with more. Until then, be lovers of freedom and anxious for the fray.